On August 7, 1942, roughly 16,000 Marines under Major General Alexander Vandegrift landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It was the first American ground offensive of the Pacific War, the first time since Pearl Harbor that the United States had moved forward instead of back. 2 nights later, at 33 minutes past 1 in the morning on August 9th, a Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa fell on the Allied warships guarding them, off a small island called Savo. In little more than half an hour, Mikawa sank 4 heavy cruisers and killed more than 1,000 American and Australian sailors. It was the worst defeat the United States Navy has ever suffered in a surface battle. And then he stopped short of the one target that mattered. Behind those sunken cruisers lay the transport ships, the ammunition, the food, and the fuel for Vandegrift's Marines. Mikawa had just destroyed everything standing between his guns and those transports. If he sank them, the first American offensive of the war was finished on its second night. At about 20 minutes past 2, with the way wide open, Mikawa turned his ships north and steamed home. He never fired a shot at the transports. Because he didn't, the Marines held Guadalcanal. Why Mikawa broke off, why he walked away from the target he had come the length of the Solomons to destroy, and why the worst night in the history of the American surface fleet is the reason that island was held, is what the next half hour is about. Everything that happened that night was about the ground. Operation Watchtower was the code name, and it had been thrown together in about 6 weeks. The objective was an airfield. Japanese construction troops had been building it near Lunga Point on the north coast of Guadalcanal. Finished, that airfield would put Japanese bombers over the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. In American hands, it would do the reverse. It would let American planes control that corner of the Solomons. Both sides understood the arithmetic. Whoever held that one airstrip held the campaign. On Guadalcanal, the landing on August 7th was almost unopposed. The field was guarded by laborers, not infantry, and when the Marines came over the beach, the construction crews dropped their tools and disappeared into the jungle. By the afternoon of August 8th, the airfield was in American hands. Tulagi, across the Sound, was another matter. The Japanese defenders there fought from caves and dugouts, and they fought nearly to the last man. Taking Tulagi and the 2 islets beside it cost the Marines around 250 casualties in a single day. Almost none of the defenders surrendered. The men doing this were the 1st Marine Division, most of them young, most of them in their first battle, many of them civilians a year before. They had trained in a hurry, shipped out in a hurry, and landed in a hurry, and now they were the tip of the entire American war against Japan. Everything the United States hoped to do in the Pacific started on that beach. Every Marine who was there learned something on the 7th that the admirals out on the water had not yet learned, that this enemy did not quit, did not break, and did not need a reason to keep fighting. That lesson returns before this is over. The trouble was that Watchtower had gone in on a shoestring. There were not enough ships, and there was not enough time, and the transports had been loaded fast, rather than in fighting order. By sundown on August 8th, much of the Marines' supply was still stacked on the beach, or still in the holds, because there had not been the hours to land it all. The men on Guadalcanal did not worry much about that yet. They had the airfield. The rest, they assumed, would come. It could only come by sea, and the sea that night belonged to Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's transports, riding at anchor off Lunga Point, and to the screen of Allied cruisers and destroyers guarding the 2 entrances into the Sound. That screen was the door. As long as it held, the Marines got their supplies. The whole beachhead depended on it. The Japanese had already shown, twice, that they could reach into that Sound from the air. Their bombers flew from Rabaul, their main base roughly 600 miles to the northwest. On August 7th, The day of the landings, they came down high against the invasion fleet. American fighters flying off the carriers climbed to meet them, and both sides lost planes in the dogfights that followed. But bombing from that altitude, through cloud, the Japanese did almost no damage to the ships. On the 8th, they changed tactics and came in low, torpedo planes skimming the water, straight at the transports. The Americans had a thin warning of those daylight raids. Up the island chain sat a handful of Australian coast watchers, men with hidden radios who spotted the bombers passing overhead and relayed the word down ahead of them. It bought the fleet a little time. In daylight, a little time was enough, because in daylight the ships could see them coming, and the anti-aircraft gunners were ready. On August 8th, the Type 1 torpedo bombers came in so low that every gun in the fleet could bear, and the fleet tore them apart. The Mitsubishi Type 1 was fast and long-legged, but it was thin-skinned, and it burned easily. The Allied crews called it the one-shot lighter. Of the more than 20 torpedo planes that pressed the attack that day, most were shot down. It was the heaviest single loss of land-based air crews the Japanese suffered in the entire Guadalcanal campaign. They did not come away with nothing. One crippled bomber deliberately crashed into the transport George F. Elliott and set her burning so badly she had to be scuttled. A torpedo also hit the destroyer Jarvis and tore open her side. The Jarvis has one more part to play in this story, but the exchange rate was brutal, and it was in the Americans' favor. A wing of Japanese aircrew for one transport and one damaged destroyer. Then the surviving Japanese flyers made a costly mistake. Back at Rabaul, they reported sinking far more than they had, well over a dozen ships. It was not close to true, but it went up the chain, and it left the Japanese command believing the Allied fleet at Guadalcanal was already half-wrecked. That false picture matters shortly. What those gun crews did over those 2 days is worth holding on to. We tend to remember this whole story for the disaster that came at night, but in daylight, for 2 days running, American sailors on open decks beat back every air attack the enemy sent, and kept the roof over the Marines' heads. Most of their names are not written down anywhere you could find them. If you've come this far with me, it's because men like those gun crews ought to be remembered. A like on this video is a small thing, but it's how a story like this reaches the people who would want to hear it. That's the only thing I'll ask of you tonight. Then let's get back to it. Because after dark on August 8th, the picture changed. By nightfall, the cruiser crews of the screening force had been at general quarters for close to 15 hours. Men cannot hold that indefinitely, so the ships stood down to a lower state of readiness. Part of the guns manned, the rest of the crews allowed to sleep. It was a reasonable decision, and it meant that when the enemy arrived, many of the guns were unmanned, and many of the men were asleep, and the enemy was already on the way. Vice Admiral Mikawa had sortied from Rabaul on August 7th, the moment he learned of the landings, with whatever he could gather. His force was his flagship, the heavy cruiser Chokai, the 4 heavy cruisers of Cruiser Division 6, Ioba, Kako, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, the 2 light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari, and the lone destroyer Unagi, 7 cruisers and a destroyer. Most of them were old ships, and they had never trained together as a group. He took them down the long channel of New Georgia Sound, which the sailors on both sides came to call the Slot, straight toward Guadalcanal. The Americans should have caught him. That is the part that is hard to forgive, and the part that was not really any one man's fault. An Australian search plane spotted Mikawa's force on the morning of August 8th, hours before the battle, in plenty of time to react. But the report it carried had to travel a road nearly as long as the ocean. The search planes over those waters answered to 2 different commands that did not share information the way they should have. The northern searches belonged to General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command. Turner's fleet belonged to Vice Admiral Gormley's South Pacific Command. And because Watchtower had been kept so secret, the pilots flying those searches had never been told the landings were happening at all. To the pilot who saw Mikawa's warships steaming toward Guadalcanal, it looked like nothing urgent. He logged it as routine. The routine report went the long way around, base to base to base, hours falling off the clock at each stop, and reached Turner roughly 8 hours after the sighting. By then, Mikawa was nearly on top of him. To make it worse, the report was garbled. It described part of Mikawa's force as seaplane tenders. So on the evening of August 8th, Turner made the reasonable and wrong assessment. Seaplane tenders meant the Japanese were probably coming to build a base of their own, not to attack. A force that small, he reasoned, would never dare a night gun battle against a fleet the size of his. He planned against what he judged the enemy would do. He did not plan against what the enemy could do. There was one more failure that night, and it separated the man in charge from the fight. Late on the 8th, Turner called a conference aboard his flagship and summoned Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, the British officer commanding the cruiser screen. Crutchley took his flagship, the Australia, out of the line to attend, and never made it back before the shooting started. Command of his southern group passed to Captain Howard Bode of the cruiser Chicago. But through a slip, the rest of the force was never clearly told. So as Mikawa came in, the Allied commander of the screen was away at a meeting, the officer left in charge did not fully know it, and half the crews were asleep. Mikawa's approach was almost unopposed. 2 American destroyers, Blue and Ralph Talbot, patrolled the mouth of the Sound as pickets, the tripwire whose whole job was to see him coming. At 54 minutes past midnight, Mikawa's lookouts sighted the Blue about 5 miles off and dead ahead. These were men with the finest night optics in the world, trained for years to fight in exactly this darkness. Mikawa slowed and prepared to fire. Then the Blue, seeing nothing, turned and steamed away on her patrol. Her sister ship lay some 10 miles to the north. Mikawa passed clean between them, and neither destroyer ever detected him. At 33 minutes past 1 on the morning of August 9th, moving around the south side of Savo Island, Mikawa gave a 2-word order: all ships attack. 3 minutes later, his lookouts picked up the Allied southern group ahead, the destroyers Bagley and Patterson, and behind them the cruisers Canberra and Chicago. Earlier that evening, Mikawa had signaled his crews in a line that deliberately echoed Nelson at Trafalgar. Every man, he told them, was expected to do his best. The first American ship to understand what was happening was the destroyer Patterson. Her warning went out over the radio, plain and desperate. Warning, warning, strange ships entering harbor. It was true, and it was too late. In the same minute, float planes Mikawa had launched ahead of his column dropped parachute flares over the anchorage, and the Allied southern group lit up against the dark. The Japanese guns had been trained and waiting. The Australian cruiser Canberra took the opening blow. She swung toward the enemy, trying to put her own hull between those guns and the transports behind her, and she was hit more than 20 times before she could answer. Her captain was mortally wounded. Her engine rooms were torn open. Her power failed. Within minutes, she was dead in the water and on fire. She would sink after dawn. The American cruiser Chicago was next, and here one officer's failure ran downhill onto everyone below him. Captain Bode, the man now in command of the southern group, though the force barely knew it, was slow coming awake and slow to grasp the attack. He turned Chicago west, away from the battle, chasing a single enemy ship into the dark, while the fight roared on behind him. His cruiser still had her main guns. She left the fight anyway, and Bode did the thing that turned a defeat into a catastrophe. He never warned the northern group. 3 more American cruisers, Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria, steamed a few miles to the north, still with no idea any of this was happening. One radio call from Bode would have alerted them. It never came. Having wrecked the southern group in about 6 minutes, Mikawa turned his column north and went looking for the rest. They were caught cold. Guns trained fore and aft, men climbing out of their bunks, officers on the bridges staring at the searchlights and telling themselves those had to be friendly ships. Aboard the Vincennes, they actually signaled the enemy to stop shining lights on them, while the shells were already in the air. A war correspondent named Joe Custer was aboard the Astoria when the Japanese salvos began falling around her. Years later, he described the men on her decks in that first shock. Men were swearing, but on the whole were fairly calm. I saw no panic. What the Japanese did to those 3 cruisers over the next 20 minutes was one-sided and merciless. They were hit from both sides at once. Turrets smashed, bridges swept, and the float planes each cruiser carried amidships, soaked in aviation gasoline, catching fire and turning each ship into a torch that lit the water for miles. Japanese night gunnery was fast, and it was accurate, and it did not let up. And still, dying, the Americans reached back. The Quincy, burning bow to stern and her captain killed on the bridge, swung her main battery around and fired. One of her last salvos struck the Chokai, Mikawa's own flagship, and put a shell into the admiral's chart room, about 20 feet from where he stood, killing and wounding the men around him. Mikawa was not hit, but the shell destroyed the charts he needed to navigate those waters in the dark. A sinking American cruiser had just taken something from him that he would need inside the hour. The Astoria did the same. With her last electrical power, an officer directed her final salvo by voice from a burning gun mount, and that shell, too, hit the Chokai. As Mikawa's column turned to leave, it ran across the picket destroyer Ralph Talbot, the same picket that had failed to see him come in. His cruisers hit her again and again as they passed. What saved her was the weather. A sudden rain squall closed over the water and hid her, and she limped away in the dark. Between them, the 2 destroyers posted as the fleet's early warning had neither warned the fleet nor been spared by it. By about 20 minutes past 2, it was over. Quincy went down within the hour. Vincennes followed minutes later. Astoria burned through the night and sank around midday. Canberra was scuttled after sunrise. More than 1,000 American and Australian sailors were killed in that half hour. Very nearly as many men as the Marines would lose in the next 6 months of fighting for the whole island. Mikawa lost no ships, and about 58 of his men. The veterans who lived through it gave the disaster a bitter name of their own, the Battle of the 5 Sitting Ducks. What those sailors bought with their lives is worth stating plainly. For every minute the cruisers stood in the enemy's path, the Japanese guns were firing at them, and not at the transports behind them. The screen died in the doorway so the men beyond it would live, and now the doorway stood open. This is the decision people have argued about for 80 years. To judge it honestly, you have to stand where Mikawa stood, on the bridge of the Chokai, a little after 2 in the morning, and look at what he actually knew. Behind him, the Allied screen was destroyed, and his own ships were nearly untouched. Ahead of him, 5 miles off in the dark, lay the transports, the reason he had come. Those transports had almost nothing left to protect them. Turner's screen was on the bottom, or in flight, and the ships carrying the Marines' entire war were, at that moment, about as close to defenseless as a fleet ever gets. His own column, though, had scattered in the fighting. He estimated it would take him the better part of 3 hours to reform and go back in. He weighed it, and he broke off. Here are his reasons, and each one is a mirror held up to American strength. The first was the sky to the east. Dawn was near. Going back for the transports and then clearing the area would leave him in open water in daylight, with no air cover, inside the reach of American aircraft carriers. Mikawa had been at Midway just 2 months earlier, and had seen with his own eyes what American carrier aircraft did to warships caught in daylight without cover. He would not hand them a second midway. What stopped him, more than anything, was fear of American carrier air power, the air power that, unknown to him, had already withdrawn. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had pulled his 3 carriers south the evening before, out of range. Mikawa was running from a threat that was no longer there, but he had no way to know that. The second reason was those charts. The Quincy's dying salvo had destroyed his navigation, and the waters of that sound were poorly mapped and full of shoals. A heavy cruiser aground in enemy waters at dawn is a dead cruiser. One shell from one burning American ship had taken away his ability to safely return. The third reason was his torpedoes. His cruisers had emptied most of their tubes in the first pass, and reloading those big torpedoes took time he did not have. A second attack would be made mostly with guns, in poor light, against whatever the Americans had managed to organize, a far riskier proposition than the ambush he had just pulled off. And the fourth reason was in his orders. The Naval General Staff had nearly forbidden this raid. The Chief of Staff, Admiral Nagano, had first called it reckless. Mikawa said after the war that he had been warned to be careful with his ships, because Japan could not replace them quickly. The cruisers under him were ones his navy could not spare, and the Japanese army had waved the landings off as no threat, promising to throw the Marines back into the sea within days. So Mikawa did what his generation had been trained to prize. He destroyed the enemy's warships, which to him meant control of the sea, and he left the ground to the army, because the army had told him it was handled. There is the sharpest mirror of all. Mikawa could afford to leave those Marines only because he had badly underestimated how hard they would be to dislodge. I have read the accounts of those minutes on the Chokai's bridge many times, and I have never once found the safe choice unreasonable from where Mikawa was standing. He was not a coward, and he was not a fool. He was a careful officer, acting on what he could see, and everything he could see told him he had already won and had little left to gain worth the risk. What he could see was wrong. The carriers were gone. Had he gone back for the transports, he could almost certainly have destroyed them and steamed home untouched. The one thing he feared most was the one thing that was not there. At about 20 minutes past 2 on August 9th, Mikawa ordered his force to reform and retire up the slot, and without ever knowing he had done it, he left the Americans holding the island. That decision is the reason this was more than one bad night. Over the 6 months that followed, so many ships went down in the waters around Savo that the sailors stopped calling it Savo Sound and started calling it Ironbottom Sound, American and Japanese steel, both. And the Japanese won a great many of those nights. They were superb night fighters. At the start of the campaign, better than the Americans, and again they came down the slot in the dark and hurt the United States Navy badly. But there was one thing they never did. They never took back the airfield. The Americans finished it and named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine flyer killed at Midway. From that strip, American aircraft flew by day, which is exactly why the Japanese could only ever move by night. So they moved by night. Destroyers ran down the slot in the dark to land fresh troops on the island, so regularly that the Marines named the traffic the Tokyo Express. Thousands of Japanese soldiers came ashore that way, and they attacked Henderson Field again and again through the fall. In the middle of November, they made their hardest try. A Japanese force built around 2 battleships came down to shell Henderson Field flat and cover a division sent to retake it. American cruisers and destroyers met them in the dark and were savaged doing it. But the field was still flying planes the next morning, and those planes helped sink a battleship and tear the troop convoy apart. Once again, the enemy won ground in the night and lost the airfield by day. By February 1943, the Japanese gave it up. They evacuated what remained of their army off Guadalcanal in the dark, the same way they had come. They had won battle after battle in those waters. They had never taken the airstrip. The turn had come early. Just 2 months after Savo, on a night in October, an American force under Rear Admiral Norman Scott lay waiting off the same island, and this time it was the Americans who had the surprise, and the radar, and the opening shot. They caught a Japanese column in the dark, sank a cruiser and a destroyer, and sent the rest running north. It was the first time in the campaign the Americans won a night action off Savo. It was not the last. The students had begun to beat the teachers. Savo was where the pattern started, and it was the clearest case of it. The enemy won the battle about as completely as a battle can be won, and then turned away from the target and went home, and the target lived. Some of that was luck, a garbled report, a shell in a chart room. A picket line slipped in the dark. Luck ran hard both ways that night, but underneath the luck was something that was not chance. Time after time in that campaign, the enemy had the Americans in his sights and could not quite believe they would be as hard to finish as they turned out to be. He kept pricing the job too cheap, and every time the men on that island made him pay full price. Guadalcanal was not held by one lucky night. It was held because the enemy never once found the Americans there cheap enough to finish off. Mikawa was the first man to make that mistake about those Marines. He was not the last. When the sun came up on August 9th, the Sound was a graveyard, and Turner's transports were getting underway to leave. The reason those transports left matters because it is the honest center of this whole story. They did not run because Mikawa beat them off. Mikawa was already gone. They left because the carriers had withdrawn the night before, and without carriers there was no air cover, and without air cover the transports could not sit in an open sound waiting for the next wave of bombers. So they hauled up and sailed. Before the Marines' supplies were fully ashore, the Marines watched their Navy go. They were left with part of what they needed and not the rest, on an island, with the sea around them suddenly empty of a single friendly ship. When their rations ran short in the weeks that followed, they ate the rice the Japanese construction crews had left stacked near the beach, living off the enemy's own stores while they held the enemy's own airfield. For a stretch there, the men on Guadalcanal were the entire American offensive in the Pacific. They knew it, and they held. Holding it was not one night's work. For months those men lived under bombing by day, shelling from the sea by night, and infantry attacks out of the jungle, on short rations, and shot through with malaria. Reinforcements and supplies fought their way in a little at a time, at a cost, all through the fall. But the men who set the terms of that whole campaign were the ones left on the beach on the 9th of August, who refused to be finished. The worst night in the history of the American surface fleet, and the survival of that beachhead happened in the same water within the same few hours, and the second was bought with the first. The enemy's own caution spared the ships that remained, and the Marines, who by every reasonable measure should have been finished, were, at first light, still digging in around the airstrip that would decide the ocean. There is one more ship to account for, and she is the hardest. The Jarvis. She was the destroyer torpedoed in the air attack on the 8th. A gash in her side, men dead, her radio knocked out. On the morning of the 9th, she was limping away alone, slow, trying to reach a repair base to the south. That same morning, the Japanese sent a strikeout from Rabaul to hunt the American carriers. On the way, one of their scouts spotted the Jarvis crawling along by herself and mistook the crippled destroyer for a cruiser. The whole strike turned and came after her. That diversion mattered more than it sounds. Those planes had gone looking for bigger game, and the American transports were right there, in the open, no fighters overhead, at the most vulnerable hour they would face. The strike that could have caught them spent itself instead on one wounded destroyer. The Navy's own historians have written that had that strike not been drawn onto the Jarvis, it might well have found the transports. The Jarvis did not go quietly. Radio dead, no way to call for help. She turned her guns on the aircraft and knocked 2 of them into the sea and damaged more. Then the torpedoes found her, and she went down south of Guadalcanal with every man aboard, more than 200 sailors, not one survivor. She was one of only 2 American destroyers in the entire war to be lost with all hands. Even dying, alone, off the edge of the battle, the Jarvis pulled the enemy's sword away from the beach one last time. As for the men who answered for that night, the Navy convened a formal inquiry as it should have. Captain Bodie was found responsible for the collapse of the Southern Group, and he did not live through the aftermath of that finding. The sea evened one small account on its own. On August 10th, the day after the victory, the American submarine S-44 caught one of Mikawa's cruisers, the Kako, on the way home and sent her to the bottom. But out on Guadalcanal, on the morning of August 9th, none of that was known yet. There was only the airfield and the Marines on it, and behind them a sound full of their own Navy's dead, and over all of it, still up, the flag. Somewhere in a great many of your families there is a man, a father, a grandfather, who was out on that ocean once, or on a beach like that one, in a year like that one. Most of what those men did was never written down. It lived in a few sentences at a kitchen table, if it was ever spoken at all, and when they were gone, a good deal of it went with them. If you carry one of those stories, something he told you once, something that never made it into any book, leave it in the comments below. Not for me, for the next person who scrolls down and reads it and remembers that these were real men with real names who did these things so the rest of us could sit here in the quiet and weigh them. Thank you for spending this time with them. I'll see you on the next one. March of 1944. A camp outside Yokohama, Japan. An American is sitting in a room 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. 1 light, 1 bamboo mat. He has shrapnel in his legs, in his arm, and in his head, and nobody has treated any of it. His name is Gregory Boyington. 2 months ago, he was the most photographed fighter pilot in the Pacific. And that same month, 5,000 miles away, President Franklin Roosevelt signs the Medal of Honor for him. They hand it to his mother, because as far as the United States of America is concerned, the man in that room is dead. The camp is called Ofuna. It does not appear on any list. The Imperial Japanese Navy never reported it as a prisoner of war camp. The Red Cross was never allowed through the gate. The names of the men held there were never given to anybody. It was secret enough that people living in the town a few streets away did not know it was there. The prisoners were officers, pilots, submariners, men who might know something worth taking. There is a line the interrogators at Ofuna used on captured American submarine crews. It turns up in the war crimes files after the surrender. It ran something like this: "You survived the sinking of a submarine." Nobody survives the sinking of a submarine, so nobody knows you are alive. We are going to ask you questions. These 2 men are going to shoot you if you do not answer them, and no one will ever know you were here. That was not something a guard improvised to frighten a man. That was the purpose of the building. Boyington had been shot down over Rabaul on the 3rd of January, 1944, leading 48 fighters 5 days before his squadron was due to come off the line. His own pilots watched him go into the clouds and never saw him again. Nobody in the United States would learn otherwise for 20 months. This is the story of those 20 months, and of the Americans who refused to let him disappear. 10 years before Ofuna, in the spring of 1934, a young man named Gregory Hallenbeck filled out an application for the Marine Aviation Cadet Program. He was turned down. The rule was simple. Married men were not eligible, and he had a wife. That should have been the end of it. Instead, he found out something his parents had kept from him his entire life. His mother had divorced his father shortly after he was born. The man who raised him was not the man on his birth certificate. His father's name was Boyington, so he filed again. Same man, same wife, new surname. There was nothing in 1934 that could catch it. No shared database, no cross-referenced index. A clerk read the name Gregory Boyington, saw a single man in his early 20s, and stamped it approved. His flying career began with a name the government had no way to verify. He joined the Marine Corps Reserve in June of 1935. He spent most of the next 6 years as a flight instructor at Pensacola, Florida, which is honest work and slow work, and not what he had signed up for. In the middle of 1941, he had a disagreement with a superior officer, and he settled it by hitting the man in the face. That is a court-martial. Everyone involved understood it was a court-martial. While he waited for the paperwork to catch up with him, recruiters came through the base looking for pilots willing to go fight in China. There was one condition: you had to resign your commission first. He took it. The charges went away with the uniform. What followed were 5 months in a P-40 with the American Volunteer Group, the outfit the newspapers called the Flying Tigers. It did not go well. He clashed with Claire Chenault almost immediately. Other pilots in the group disliked him and said so out loud. And across those 5 months of combat flying, he wrecked more airplanes of his own than he shot down of anybody else's. He came home claiming 6 kills. The American Volunteer Group credited him with 2. That gap is where every argument about this man begins, so it is worth slowing down for, because the gap is not quite what people think it is. The AVG counted air-to-air victories one way and aircraft destroyed on the ground another way. A fighter caught sitting on a runway, or one hit as it was lifting off with its wheels still hanging down, went into a separate column. It counted for the war. It did not count toward the score that turned a pilot into an ace. 6 and 2 were not necessarily the lie and the truth. They were 2 different columns, but the number that reached the Marine Corps was 6. Later in 1942, he walked back into the Corps and was handed a major's commission. Nobody raised Pensacola. Nobody wrote to China to check. The 6 went into his record because there was no one in the room to say otherwise. And from that point forward, he carried something no amount of flying ever burned off: a reputation as a man whose figures needed checking. The squadron he was handed was not new. That part of the story got tidied up later. Marine Fighting Squadron 214 was commissioned on the 1st of July, 1942, at Ewa Field on Oahu. The men called themselves the Swashbucklers. They flew 2 combat tours in the Solomons, out of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, and when the tours ended, the squadron was broken up, and the pilots were sent home. The number went into a drawer at the Marine Command on Espiritu Santo. In August of 1943, Boyington was working a desk on Espiritu Santo, running the pool of replacement pilots. Men came in from the States, waited around, and got parceled out to whichever squadron was short. Then a request came down for a fresh fighter squadron, and nobody back home answered it. So he went to his superiors with an idea. He had a yard full of pilots that no unit had claimed. Give him the men, and give him the number sitting in that drawer. They gave him both. They also gave him Major Stan Bailey as his executive officer, and a deadline, under 4 weeks, to take 27 men and turn them into something that could fly into Rabaul. A few of them were veterans with victories already to their name. A few had never seen a Japanese airplane. Several had never flown a Corsair. On the evening of September 13, 1943, the pilots crowded into their commanding officer's hut and started arguing about what to call themselves. What they came up with was Boyington's Bastards. They meant it as a description. The way they told it, they were orphans nobody had wanted, with a handful of airplanes that would not stay running and no mechanics to call their own. Some of that was a story they enjoyed telling about themselves, and the men who serviced those corsairs would have had a few words about the mechanics part. But the feeling underneath it was real enough. The next morning they brought the name to Captain Jack Deschamps, the Marine Public Information Officer on the island. Deschamps told them no newspaper in America would print it. Then he handed them Black Sheep, which means exactly the same thing and can run above the fold. It stuck inside a week. The commander got renamed too. He was 30, close to a decade older than most of the men flying under him, so they started calling him Gramps. Then one of his own pilots, Lieutenant Paul Mullen, who would finish the war an ace himself, rewrote a verse of an old drinking song called The Whiffenpoof to fit him. Gramps became Pappy. The war correspondents picked it up almost immediately. There were a great many of them in the South Pacific in late 1943, and they were hungry. 2 of those 27 names are worth holding on to: Bill Case, Chris McGee. Both of them end this story on a bar stool in San Francisco. The Black Sheep flew their first mission on September 16, 1943, escorting a large force of dive bombers and torpedo bombers against Japanese positions in the northern Solomons. Boyington came home from that one mission claiming 5 Japanese fighters. 5 in a single day is a rare thing. It happened maybe a few dozen times in the entire Pacific War. And it happened to a man who, 6 weeks earlier, had been running a personnel desk. Within days, his name was in newspapers across the United States. The papers put his total at 11, because they added the 6 he had claimed in China to the 5 he had just claimed over the Solomons. Hold on to that number. 11. It is going to matter later, and not in the way the papers meant it. September 27th, another one. Then October 4th, and this is the day worth stopping on. He came down through a formation of Japanese fighters and shot down 3 of them in a single firing pass, in under 60 seconds. He described what happened to each one afterward. 1 caught fire. 1 went into the ground. 1 pilot took to his parachute, which almost never happened with Japanese fighter pilots and was noted as unusual at the time. He was flying with a group of other corsairs. They watched the whole thing. Not one man in that flight filed a claim of his own that day. Whatever else gets argued about this man, and plenty does, October 4th is not up for argument. 2 weeks later came Kahili. On October 17th, the squadron took 24 fighters and circled an airfield where roughly 60 Japanese aircraft were sitting. They did not attack it. They just orbited it, in plain view, daring the field to come up after them. The field came up. By the squadron's own account of that afternoon, 20 Japanese aircraft were shot down. The Black Sheep lost nobody. That is the mission the Marine Corps would single out in his citation, and the 20 is the figure the citation itself uses. Then the pace changed, and not in his favor. Early November he was pulled out and sent to Australia for rest. He came back on the 27th, hungry. Through the first 3 weeks of December, the squadron flew sweeps and patrols and kept finding empty sky. The Japanese would not come up. He spent those weeks strafing ground targets, which is dangerous, useful, and does absolutely nothing for a scoreboard. And there was a scoreboard now, whether he wanted one or not. Eddie Rickenbacker had finished the First World War as America's highest-scoring pilot, 26. That number had stood for 25 years. Joe Foss, another Marine, had already matched it over Guadalcanal. Boyington was closing on both of them, and everybody in the South Pacific Press Corps knew it. On December 23rd, over Rabaul, he claimed 4 in about 20 minutes, working from 10,000 feet all the way down to 500. The papers put him at 24, 2 behind. On December 27th, the squadron ran into a large formation over Rabaul and came away with 7. One of them was his, 25, 1 short. And here is the part that gets left out of most tellings of this story. The squadron's second combat tour was scheduled to end on January 8, 1944. That was not a rumor, it was on paper. When it ended, the pilots would be scattered back into the replacement pool, the way they had been gathered from it, and Marine Fighting Squadron 214 would be a number in a drawer again. So when Boyington walked out to his Corsair on the morning of January 3rd, he was not chasing a record in some open-ended way. He had 5 days left. A few days before that morning, talking with his pilots, Boyington had said something that half of them would repeat for the rest of their lives. "If you ever see me going down with a pack of zeros on my tail, do not give me up. I will meet you in a bar in San Diego, and we will have a drink for old times." It was the kind of thing men said to each other out there. Nobody wrote it down at the time. Every one of them remembered it. At 6:40 in the morning on January 3rd, 1944, he lifted off from the strip at Torokina on Bougainville. He was not leading his squadron that day. He was in tactical command of 48 fighters, 8 Corsairs from his own VMF 214, 20 more Corsairs from Squadrons 211 and 223, and 20 Hellcats from Navy Fighting Squadron 33. 48 aircraft pointed at Rabaul. They lost 6 of them before anyone saw the target. 2 Corsairs from 223 and 4 from his own squadron turned back en route. Electrical faults, hydraulics, oxygen systems that would not hold. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone could have prevented, just machinery quitting on men a long way from home. The rest went in. 3 staggered formations came over St. George's Channel between 20,000 and 24,000 feet. Visibility was poor. The air was hazy and thick, and there was solid overcast sitting above them at 28,000. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of sky where airplanes disappear from each other. At 8:15, his division made contact, high over Tobera. Tobera was a Japanese airfield, and the fighters coming up at them belonged to it. Boyington's 4 Corsairs found roughly 12 Zeros at 19,000 feet and went at them. 3 American pilots were credited with a kill in that opening fight: Captain George Ashman, Lieutenant Bruce Matheson, and Boyington. Then Ashman went down. He was posted missing in action, and he never came home. And somewhere in the middle of it, a 20-millimeter shell hit Boyington's Corsair and tore open the belly of the airplane. The shell put fragments through his legs, through his forearm, through his head. He lost altitude, then caught the airplane and leveled it off, and flew for a short distance out over St. George's Channel. For a minute or two, it looked like he might make it out over water and get picked up. Then the fuel tank caught fire. He got on the radio and said he was going in. At about 8:45, he went over the side. He was very low when he jumped. The parachute opened just above the waves. Now, between 8:15 and 8:45, there are 30 minutes over Rabaul that no American pilot saw. Boyington claimed 3 victories during that fight. 2 of the 3 had nobody watching. That afternoon, back at Torokina, 2 divisions of Corsairs from his own squadron took off and searched for an hour. They knew roughly where he had gone in. They found nothing, and the light went, and they came home. 5 days later, on January 8, 1944, the second combat tour of the Black Sheep formally ended, exactly as scheduled. The pilots went back into the replacement pool. The number went back into the drawer. Their commanding officer had been gone for 5 days, and as far as anyone in the United States Marine Corps could establish, he had gone into the water off New Britain and stayed there. Every air battle in that war produced 2 sets of books. One written by the men who flew home, and one written by the men they had been shooting at. For most of the war, only one of those 2 was available to Americans. The American books closed on January 3rd with 7 Japanese fighters confirmed destroyed and 5 more listed as probables. The Japanese books closed with 8 Corsairs and 1 Hellcat. Both sides were wrong, and they were wrong by roughly the same amount, which is worth remembering the next time anybody quotes a score at you. Here is what came out of the Japanese unit records after the war. The fighters that came up over Tobera belonged to the 253rd Air Group. They put 37 Zeros into the air that morning under a lieutenant named Kenji Nakagawa. 4 of those 37 were carrying small bombs, which tells you they had been expecting a different kind of mission. All 37 of them landed back at Tobera at 9 o'clock. Every one. 1 pilot came home with a minor wound. 1 airplane came home with bullet damage. That is the entire ledger for the unit Boyington's division fought. 15 miles north of Tobera, at Lakunai, a second Japanese group put up 33 more fighters. Those aircraft ran into the Corsairs of Squadrons 211 and 223, and this is where 2 American names deserve to be said out loud, because almost nobody says them. Captain J.W. Ireland of VMF 223 took a Japanese fighter head-on, firing through the pass, and watched it burn, come apart, and fall away. Captain R. L. Hopkins, same squadron, put rounds into another one and watched it stagger, roll onto its back, and the pilot come halfway out of the cockpit, already gone. Squadron 211 claimed only probables that day, which means Ireland and Hopkins almost certainly accounted for the only 2 Japanese fighters actually lost on January 3, 1944. Their names were Hideshi Tanimoto and Yoshige Kitake, both flight petty officers, both from the group at Lakunai. Added up and the day was even. 2 aircraft lost on each side. George Ashmun and Gregory Boyington for the Americans, Tanimoto and Kitake for the Japanese. Which brings us to the number. There are 3 totals for Gregory Boyington in circulation, and all 3 of them appear in serious sources: 24, 26, 28. They differ for 2 reasons, and neither reason requires anybody to be lying. The first is China, and the columns we talked about earlier. Whether you fold 2 credited victories into the Pacific total, or 6 claimed ones, or none at all, changes the arithmetic before he ever reaches the Solomons. The second is those 30 minutes over Rabaul. He filed 3. One of them had other Americans in the sky to confirm it. 2 of them did not, and the Japanese records do not show losses to match them. So pick a number. Historians have been picking for 80 years, and they have not converged. What both sets of books agree on is smaller and stranger than any of that. Neither one recorded that he was alive. The American file said missing. The Japanese, who had him, said nothing at all to anybody. Before we go into the part of this story that almost never gets told, one small thing. A lot of you watching had a father or a grandfather out in the Pacific, and most of those men did not leave much behind in writing. If that is your family, put his name and his unit in the comments. Somebody reading this will recognize it. That has happened here before. A Japanese submarine, the I-181, picked him out of the water off New Britain. That is not a small thing to sit with. He had spent 3 months trying to sink and burn everything the Japanese had in that harbor, and the thing that saved his life was a Japanese crew pulling a wounded American over the side. They took him into Rabaul first, then Truk, then Saipan, then Iwo Jima, and finally to Yokohama. By March of 1944, he was in Ofuna. We were there at the start of this. Now here is what a day in it looked like. Prisoners were not permitted to speak to one another. They were not permitted to look one another in the face. Eyes down, always. They were expected to learn enough Japanese to understand orders, because orders were not going to be repeated in English. Every morning began with roll call in the yard. Any deviation from any of it was answered with a beating. He had shrapnel wounds in his legs and his arm and his head when he arrived, and those wounds were left to do whatever they were going to do. He got malaria. The beatings were regular rather than exceptional. The camp commander was named Yokura Sashizo. After the war, he was tried and sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. Boyington was not the only man in there whose name meant something. Louis Zamperini passed through Ofuna. So did Richard O'Kane, who had commanded the most successful American submarine of the entire war before he was sunk and pulled out of the sea himself. Three of the most recognizable Americans in the Pacific War, moving through the same small compound within about a year of each other, and the rules of the place meant that any two of them who did overlap were forbidden to speak. Now about his weight, because there is a version of this story that has been repeated for 80 years and it is not right. The version says his health improved in captivity because he could not get a drink. Here is what the record actually shows. Gregory Boyington lost close to 70 pounds as a prisoner. There are accounts that later on he got himself assigned to a camp kitchen and that things improved from there. There are accounts that a Japanese cook slipped him extra food, and there are accounts from other prisoners, less flattering ones, about what he did and did not pass along to the men around him. I am not going to sort those out for you. They come from men who were starving, and starving men remember unevenly, and every one of them earned the right to their own version. What is not in dispute is the 70 pounds. He also spent his first stretch in that camp, working very hard at being nobody. He knew what he was. He was the most publicized Marine pilot in the Pacific, and he had every reason to believe that being recognized in an interrogation camp would go badly for him. By his own account, he was afraid of exactly that. And by his own account, when they finally did work out who he had been, the thing that surprised him was that it went the other direction. Some of his captors treated him better afterward, not worse. Month 4 came and went. Then month 9. At some point in there, he got one piece of information out. Through another prisoner, he managed to pass a single code word back to his mother in the United States. One word, arranged in advance, that meant he was alive. That was the entire communication between Gregory Boyington and his family for 20 months. In April of 1945, they moved him out of Ofuna and took him to Omori. Omori was an artificial island in Tokyo Bay, connected to the shore by a narrow wooden bridge. Men were held there and worked there. Able-bodied prisoners were marched out to the docks and warehouses nearby, and they did as little useful work as they could get away with, and quietly ruined as much of it as they thought they could survive ruining. He was not the first American in that camp with a story. One of the men already there was named James Landrum, Richmond, Virginia, electrician's mate first class. Everybody on his boat called him Slim, because he was 6 feet 4 inches tall. He had turned 20 a short while before he was captured. His boat was the submarine Grenadier, 76 men. She left Australia on the 20th of March 1943, and a month later she was hit by a Japanese aircraft in the Lem Voalan Strait, northwest of Penang. She went down to the bottom and settled at 270 feet. Her crew spent a day down there in the dark, fighting fires and trying to get power back, and they got her up. On the 22nd of April they surfaced, scuttled her, and went into the water to wait. While they were floating there, waiting for Japanese ships to come and take them, one of the crew read stories out loud from a copy of Reader's Digest. That is a detail worth hearing twice. 76 men in the ocean, their boat gone underneath them, an enemy warship coming up on them, and one of them is reading aloud to keep everybody steady. Those men went into the camps and stayed there for the rest of the war. At Omori, Landrum and 3 other prisoners decided to make an American flag. Their names were Norman Albertson, Raymond Jakubielski, and Lorenzo Miricio. They had no cloth, so they took bed sheets, 1½ of them sewn together by hand. The finished flag came out 74 inches by 44. They had no rulers, nothing to measure with at all. So they laid out the field of stars and the stripes by eye, and when men who know flags looked at it afterward, the proportions were very nearly right. They had no dye. What they had were blue and red-colored pencils out of American Red Cross parcels, and they colored the whole thing in by hand. If the guards had found it, the men who made it would have been beaten badly, and quite possibly killed. And according to what Landrum's family has said since, the guards were not the only problem. Some of the senior American prisoners in that camp told them to stop and threatened them with court-martial after the war if they did not, because if the flag was discovered, every man in Omori would pay for it. They kept sewing, and every so often when American aircraft came over the bay, they carried it up and spread it out on the roof of the barracks, not as a signal for rescue. There was no rescue coming, just so that whoever was up there could see that somebody was still down here. If that lands for you the way it lands for me, take a second and hit the like button. Those 4 men are the reason this part of the story exists at all, and most people have never heard their names. Denny Landrum was 6 feet 4 inches tall. At his lowest point in that camp, he weighed 92 pounds. He had been in Japanese hands for 2 years by the time a Marine major named Boyington was brought in through the gate. Japan surrendered on the 15th of August, 1945. Almost immediately, American aircraft started flying over the camps and dropping supplies. Medicine, food, clothing, toothbrushes, razors, crates coming down under parachutes onto men who had been eating rice and water for years. But the crews doing the dropping did not have good maps of where the prisoners were, or who they were, or how many. The men on the ground had to tell them. They had no paint. What they had was Japanese tooth powder and water to mix it with. So they climbed onto the barracks roofs at Omori and they wrote. They put up the letters PW in the largest characters they could manage, so nobody overhead could mistake the place for anything else. They wrote a line asking for candy and food and passage home, and thanking whoever was reading it. And somewhere on those roofs, in wet tooth powder, somebody wrote 4 words, "Pappy Boyington here." One of the pilots who came over dropped half a pack of cigarettes with a note wrapped around it. The note said to hang on, it would not be long now. Then an aircraft came across low, and somebody in it took a photograph. Be careful about what that photograph did, because the story usually gets stretched here. It did not crack the case. It was not how American intelligence discovered that Gregory Boyington was alive. It was how his own men found out. In August of 1945, the surviving black sheep were scattered across the Pacific and the United States, mustering out, packing up, going back to whatever they had been before. Their commanding officer had been gone for 20 months, and every one of them had accepted what that meant. And then word came around. Boyington was not dead. Boyington was in Tokyo Bay, and on top of that, the Marine Corps was now calling him the top-scoring Marine ace of the war. For men who had flown on his wing, it read like something out of a story that does not happen. On the 29th of August, 1945, Omori was liberated. Denny Landrum and the men who had sewn that flag ran it up on a firefighting pole they had stolen and stood there waving it as the boats came in. Somebody took that picture too, and it became one of the enduring photographs of the end of that war. Afterward, another prisoner carried the flag home, and then it disappeared. Landrum spent the rest of his life looking for it and never found it. He died in 1980, at 56. His son took over the search. They found it in a warehouse at the Washington Navy Yard. It is called the Omori Liberation Flag now. It hangs at the Virginia War Memorial in Richmond, on loan from the Naval History and Heritage Command. Anybody can walk in and look at it. He came home on the 12th of September, 1945. 21 former members of the Black Sheep were there when he arrived. Photographers were there too, and this time nobody had to count airplanes on a runway. Now think back to what he had told his pilots that week in December of 1943. "If you see me go down, do not give me up. I will meet you in a bar in San Diego, and we will have a drink for old times." He got the city wrong. It was San Francisco. Late in 1945, in the bar at the St. Francis Hotel, Gregory Boyington sat down with the men who had flown with him. Two of them are in the photographs from that night. Bill Case, Chris McGee, those are the two names from that hut on Espiritu Santo, September of 1943, when 27 unwanted pilots sat around arguing about what to call themselves. Life magazine covered the party. It ran in the issue dated October 1st, 1945. Boyington's own comment about it, years later, was that the coverage was thorough and the pictures came out impressive, and that it was probably just as well the photographers had not been around for the parties they used to throw in the South Pacific. From San Francisco, he was ordered to Washington. On the 4th of October, 1945, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Alexander Vandegrift, pinned the Navy Cross on him. The next day, October 5th, President Truman put the Medal of Honor around his neck at the White House, which meant that medal was handed over twice, once in the spring of 1944 to a woman in Washington state who had been told her son was dead and who had exactly one word to go on, and once in the autumn of 1945 to the son. There is one more piece to this, and it is a strange one. Years after the war, a former Japanese pilot named Masajiro Kawato emigrated to the United States and began telling people he was the man who shot Boyington down. The operations log of his unit does confirm that Kawato was in the air over Rabaul that morning. It also shows that because he was inexperienced, he was flying the third aircraft in a four-plane section assigned to fly top cover above the fighters that were actually engaged. Make of that what you will. It did not slow either man down. Through the 70s and 80s, the two of them turned up at American air shows with their tables set up near each other, selling their books, needling each other across the aisle in front of the crowds and doing very well out of it. He never really fit back in. He left active duty in 1947. 4 marriages, a run of jobs that would not hold. Brewery manager, salesman. For a stretch, a referee at professional wrestling matches. In 1958, he published his memoir. 18 years after that, a television series built on it put him back in front of America, with his own name in the credits as technical advisor, and a good many of the men who had actually flown with him thought very little of the result. Chris McGee, who sat beside him at the St. Francis that night, the second highest scoring ace in the squadron, went on to fly fighters for Israel, run bootleg liquor, and rob banks. They stayed black sheep. Gregory Boyington died on the 11th of January 1988 in Fresno, California. He was 75. He is buried at Arlington. The line he said more often than any other, he said about himself. He took the shape of it from F. Scott Fitzgerald and made it his own. "Show me a hero and I will show you a bum." He was not being modest, and he was not fishing for an argument. He had worked both of those jobs and he knew exactly what each one was worth. For 20 months, the United States held no document proving this man was alive. The Marine Corps had a file that said missing. Japan had a camp it would not admit to. His mother had one word, passed hand to hand through a prison. What brought him back was not the medal. The medal was already written. It was 4 words in wet tooth powder, on a barracks roof in Tokyo Bay, put there by men whose names nobody knew either. The largest battleship ever built had 150 guns pointed at the sky, and a single American plane flew straight down the middle of them. It came in low over the water. It climbed, and it passed between the battleship's conning tower and her smokestack, close enough that the men on the bridge could have read the numbers on its wings. 150 guns, and not one of them could bring it down. On that bridge stood a young sailor of the Imperial Japanese Navy named Kosaka Koitabashi. He had been told a certain thing about the Americans. Every man in that fleet had been told it, that the Americans were soft, that they would not press an attack home, that they were, in the word he used himself all his life afterward, sissies. He watched that pilot thread the needle through a wall of fire and come out the other side, and a thing he had believed since he was a boy began to come apart in his hands. That was the 24th of October, 1944, the day before the battle you are here to learn about. Stay with me this morning, because the men who flew those planes were not chasing medals, and most of their names never reached the history books. But for the next few minutes, they have earned every second of your attention. What happened off the island of Samar the following dawn should not have been a battle at all. It should have been a slaughter. A handful of slow little carriers, built on merchant hulls, and a thin line of destroyers stood in the path of the most powerful surface fleet Japan ever sent to sea. The battleship Yamato alone weighed more than all 6 of those little carriers put together. By every rule of arithmetic, they were already dead. And the strangest part of the whole affair is this. When the shooting stopped, it was not the small ships that had run, it was the giants. To this day, men argue about why. Some of the answers are locked away in the mind of a Japanese admiral who took them to his grave. But part of the answer flew off the decks of those little carriers that morning with almost nothing to fight with, and kept coming anyway. It was supposed to be an ordinary morning. The escort carriers of a group the Navy called Taffy 3 were doing what they had been built to do, launching a few planes at first light to hunt submarines and to help the soldiers who were fighting their way inland across Leyte. The men on those flight decks expected a long, dull day. Their planes were loaded for that dull day. Depth charges for submarines, small bombs meant for troops and trucks on a beach, machine guns. Nothing on those racks was built to punch through the armored hide of a battleship. Nobody had thought they would need it. It was an Avenger pilot named William C. Brooks, flying an early patrol off the escort carrier St. Lo, who saw them first. He was doing the ordinary work of the morning, watching the water for submarines, when he looked down through a gap in the clouds and saw ships to the north. He looked closer. The pagoda masts, the great flat shapes behind them. These were not American ships. He counted battleships. Brooks got on the radio and reported what he was seeing. Back on the carriers, the admiral could not believe him and asked him to check again. The most powerful fleet in the Japanese Navy could not possibly be here, bearing down on a few unarmed escort carriers, with the whole of the American battle line supposedly guarding the door to the north. But it was here. So Ensign Brooks did the only thing a man in his position could do. He turned his little plane over and dived on a Japanese cruiser to attack it. The only weapon he was carrying was 2 depth charges, barrels of explosive built to sink submarines, dropped on a warship the size of a city block. It was almost nothing, a man throwing stones at a moving wall. He dropped them anyway. That single act, at the very start, is the whole story of the day in miniature. The right man, the wrong weapon, diving in, regardless. He could not have known, pulling out of that dive, that the whole strange shape of the next few hours was already set. That the men of Taffy 3 would fight this battle not with the weapons they wished for, but with the ones already bolted to their planes when the enemy came over the horizon, and that, somehow, it would be enough. The Japanese fleet had come a long, hard road to reach that water. They had already paid for it in blood, and they knew it. 2 days earlier, in the dark before dawn, that same fleet had been steaming through a narrow passage west of the Philippines. 2 American submarines were waiting, Darter and Dace. They put their torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Atago, which happened to be the flagship, with the fleet commander aboard. She rolled over and went down in 18 minutes. They sank a second cruiser, the Maya, and crippled a third, the Takao, which had to turn for home. The Japanese admiral, a man named Kurita, went into the water and swam for his life. When they pulled him aboard a destroyer, soaked through and shaking with fever, the first words out of his mouth were a question. He asked if anyone had any whiskey. It was a hard way to begin. A fleet that loses its commander's own flagship in the first dark hours, before it has fired a shot in anger, before it has even reached the enemy it sailed out to fight, is a fleet already wrestling with its own doubts. The admiral would not sleep again for 3 days, and the worst of the road was still in front of them. The next day the sky opened on him. Wave after wave of American planes came down on his fleet as it crossed a body of water called the Sibuyan Sea. This was the 24th. The day Koitabashi stood on the bridge of the Yamato and watched an American fly between the tower and the stack. There were hundreds of those planes over the course of that day. They came in flights, broke apart, and bored in one after another through a sky so thick with fire that the Japanese gunners could not believe anything could live in it. The Yamato and the Musashi threw up everything they had, colored bursts to mark their own shells. Tracer, steel raining back down into the sea. And still the American pilots pushed their noses down and came. They were not the same men who would fly off the little carriers the next morning. These were the aviators of the big American carriers to the north, older hands with faster planes. But they were cut from the same cloth, and they taught the Japanese fleet a lesson that day that it carried into Samar. That American airmen did not scare off, that they would keep coming until the target was on the bottom, or they were. By late afternoon, the planes had found the battleship Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato and one of the 2 greatest battleships Japan ever put to sea. They put something like 17 bombs and 19 torpedoes into her. Some of that was more than she needed. She went down that evening, taking most of her crew with her. A silence settled over the bridge of the Yamato as the men watched her go. "We had thought these ships could not be sunk," Koitabashi said, remembering it decades later. That evening, the surviving Japanese fleet turned back toward the strait that would carry them past Samar and into the American landings. Threading a fleet that size through the San Bernardino Strait in the dark was a feat of plain seamanship, and they brought it off. They came out the far side after midnight, braced to be met by the American battle line, and found empty ocean. The way was open. The Americans who should have been guarding that door had gone north, chasing a decoy. There was nothing left in front of the Japanese giants but the little ships of Taffy 3, who did not yet know they were there. On the bridge of the Yamato, the lookouts saw them first. Out of the breaking mist came the unmistakable flat shapes of aircraft carriers. To men who had prayed for exactly this, it looked like the answer to every prayer they had. They did not know these were escort carriers, small ships built on merchant hulls to ferry planes and shepherd convoys. They saw carriers and took them for the great fleet carriers of the American Navy. They saw the thin screen of destroyers and took them for cruisers. Here, they believed, was the decisive battle their whole navy had been built to fight, come over the horizon and closing. Koitabashi watched the battleships Kongo and Haruna surge past at 30 knots with their great guns already firing, and he was ashamed, when he told it in his old age, of how the sight had thrilled him. "It seemed to me," he said, "like a movie. That thrill did not survive contact." The orders coming down from the flag were a tangle almost from the first minute. The admiral called for one formation, then changed his mind and signaled a general attack, and his captains went charging off on their own headings with little coordination between them. His own chief of staff admitted afterward that no heed was taken of order. The most powerful fleet in that ocean went into the fight, tripping over its own feet, and the small, quick blows coming at it from the sea and the sky would not give it a moment to sort itself out. Which brings us back to Ensign Brooks and his 2 depth charges and a morning that had just stopped being ordinary. The admiral commanding Taffy 3 did not waste time on despair. He turned his carriers away from the enemy at their best speed, which was a crawl, barely 17 knots, and ran them toward a rain squall for cover. He ordered his ships to lay smoke, and he threw every plane he had into the air, armed with whatever happened to be hanging under them. Some carried a few bombs, some carried machine guns and nothing else. Some carried the depth charges meant for that morning's submarine patrol. They did not have time to form up into a proper strike. They did not wait for one another. They went at the enemy 1 and 2 at a time, whatever they had, as fast as the deck crews could launch them. There was no plan for this. There could not have been. No one had ever drawn up orders for how a squadron of submarine hunters should attack 4 battleships and 8 cruisers, because no one had ever imagined they would have to. So the men wrote the orders themselves, in the air, in the first few minutes, out of nothing but nerve and a plain refusal to leave their carriers undefended. The first ones to reach the Japanese line threw the wrong weapons at it with everything they had. Depth charges tumbled down onto cruisers. Light bombs meant for infantry burst against armored decks. The heavy cruiser Suzuya took hits from the air, staggered, and fell out of formation. It was not that the bombs were sinking these ships. Most of them could not. It was that a warship being dived on has to turn, has to break its aim, has to answer the thing coming down out of the sun instead of the target it was trying to hit. They flew planes that were never built for this. The little Wildcat fighters and the Avenger bombers off those escort carriers had been chosen for slow, patient work, watching the water for submarines, nursing along over a beachhead while the soldiers moved inland. They were not fast, and there were not many of them. But they were flown by men who had decided, without anyone putting it into so many words, that they would not stand aside and let the enemy have a clean shot at the ships they were sworn to guard. Every dive bought the little carriers a few more seconds of life. The pilots understood that. So when the bombs were gone, they did not go home. They came around again and strafed, raked the decks and the bridges with machine gun fire, aiming for the men out in the open, the range takers and the gun crews, anyone whose job it was to help those big guns find their mark. And then the machine gun ammunition ran out too. Here is where the morning becomes something I have never quite found anywhere else in the record, because the American pilots still did not leave. They had dropped their bombs. They had fired off every round. Some of them had climbed into their planes at dawn with almost nothing to begin with, and now they had nothing at all, so they faked it. A pilot with an empty bomb bay would open the bay doors and push over into a torpedo run he could not make, on a cruiser he could not hurt, with a weapon he did not have. And the Japanese ship, not knowing the bay was empty, would heave itself over in a hard turn to dodge a torpedo that was never coming. Thousands of tons of steel, swerving to avoid a bluff. A battleship that is turning cannot shoot straight. A cruiser combing the water for torpedoes, real or imagined, is not closing the range on a fleeing carrier. Every hard rudder, every gun captain who lifted his eye from the target to search the sky for the next plane cost the Japanese the one thing they could not spare: time. And the little carriers, wallowing along at their crawl, spent every borrowed minute of it buying their own lives. One American, out of anything else to throw, flew down alongside a Japanese ship in a slow roll and emptied his sidearm at it out of the open cockpit. A pistol. Against a warship. By one account remembered on the Japanese side, a man aboard that ship watched the whole thing and never forgot it. It is worth saying plainly who these men were. They were not, most of them, the polished professionals of a peacetime navy. They were young. A great many were reservists, boys who 2 or 3 years before had been in classrooms and on farms and behind store counters across America. They had learned to fly in a hurry, because their country needed pilots in a hurry. and they had been sent to the quietest corner of the fleet to do the patient, unglamorous work nobody wrote songs about. And so there was only a line of enemy guns between the enemy and their friends, and a choice each man made alone in his cockpit, over and over again, to put his nose down and go in one more time. That is the thing to hold on to. Not one of them had to. Every dive was a decision. I have read a great many accounts of men caught in a hopeless fight, and I have never found another where so many of them chose to keep attacking after every weapon they owned was gone. They were not trying to sink those ships. By then they knew they could not. They were trying to confuse them, to crowd them, to make the most powerful fleet in that ocean flinch and turn and lose its aim, again and again, and never once get a clean, settled shot at the carriers behind them. Empty hands, against battleships. And it was working. The pilots were not alone out there in front. Between the enemy and the carriers, a thin line of destroyers and smaller destroyer escorts had turned and charged the Japanese fleet head-on. Ships a fraction of the size of what they were attacking, throwing torpedoes and 5-inch shells at battleships, laying smoke, dying where they stood, so the carriers behind them could run. Their story is its own kind of legend, and it deserves its own telling on another day. But understand what the two of them did together, the tin cans on the water and the planes in the sky. Between them they turned a clean execution into a brawl. They filled the sea and the air over that Japanese fleet with so much smoke and noise and sudden death that the enemy could never settle, never steady himself, never get a long, clear look at how small the thing chasing him really was. But the planes could not stay up forever. And when they came down, they found they had nowhere to land. Their own carriers were fleeing downwind, twisting through smoke and shell fire. You cannot land a plane on a carrier that is running the wrong way into the wind, with columns of water erupting all around it. So the order went out that told those men exactly what kind of morning this was. Attack the enemy. Then fly to the airstrip at Tacloban. On the beachhead the army had just clawed out of the island, and land there to rearm and refuel. Or find any other carrier still able to take you aboard. What followed was chaos of the finest kind. Pilots came down on whatever deck they could reach, from whatever squadron, off whatever ship. Down in the next group of carriers to the south, one flat-top named Manila Bay took aboard and serviced planes belonging to nearly a dozen squadrons that were not her own. At one point, she had aircraft from 4 different carriers sitting on her deck at the same time. The peacetime rulebook for carrier operations went straight over the side. There was no time for it. Deck crews grabbed any American plane with a star on its wing, threw fuel into it, hung whatever weapons they had under it, and flung it back into the sky. One pilot, a man named Bennett, put his plane down on the Manila Bay, and her crew loaded him with 4 500-pound bombs. He took off again, joined a strike, and went back out and put those bombs into one of the very cruisers that had been trying to kill his friends all morning. They were turning the fight around, one plane at a time. Land, load, launch, do it again. The Navy had a name for ships like theirs. The little carriers were classed with 3 letters, CVE, and the men who sailed them had turned those letters into a bitter joke. Combustible, vulnerable, expendable. They knew exactly what the rest of the fleet thought of them. They knew they had been handed the thinnest hulls and the slowest speed and the smallest guns, and sent off to run the errands nobody else wanted. And on the one morning when everything turned on them, the combustible, vulnerable, expendable ships and the men who flew from them did not run and did not break. There is a number that tells the story of that morning better than any speech. By the time the strikes were coming thick, the planes off those little carriers and that dirt airstrip were hitting the Japanese admiral from more than a dozen flight decks at once. To a man staring up through the smoke, that looked like the air groups of 4 or 5 great fleet carriers. It was not. It was a handful of jeep carriers, a beachhead runway, and a great many tired men who would not quit. And some of those men were flying back to a landing strip that was still, itself, a battlefield. Tacloban had been in American hands for only a matter of days, and it was barely a strip at all. Crude, unfinished, churned to mud, not yet ready for regular flying. The fighting had not moved far past it. Japanese troops were still close enough to shoot at the field, and enemy planes worked it over so often that it was said to be lit at night by its own burning aircraft. None of that mattered to a pilot coming in on his last few gallons. He put down where he could. There was some ammunition on the ground there, and a supply of aviation gas, and men who would fuel and load a plane and send it back up while the shooting went on around them. By some accounts, flyers who came down at the roughest strips were handed rifles and told to help hold the line before they could get airborne again. It was that kind of morning, at that kind of place. Attack the enemy. Land wherever you can. Take on board whatever they can give you. Go back out. That was the whole of the plan, and the men flew it over and over through the long hours of the morning. Out over the water, the little ships were paying the price for the time all this bought them. The Japanese battleships and cruisers had closed the range now, and they were beginning to hit. A carrier named Gambier Bay took blow after blow and could not pull away. The Yamato herself came so close to that burning ship that the men on the battleship's deck could look across the water and see American sailors dragging fire hoses across their own flight deck, fighting to save her. Koitabashi was watching from the bridge, and it is what he saw next that he could never shake. Gambier Bay went down, destroyers went down, and American sailors ended up in the water in their hundreds, oil-soaked, clinging to wreckage, as the great gray hull of the Yamato slid past them, close enough to touch. They should have been broken men. Their ships were gone. The largest warship on Earth was steaming through the middle of them. Instead, some of them waved at the Yamato, at the enemy, as if to say, "We are still here, and we are not afraid of you." Koitabashi stared at them and could not understand it. A Japanese sailor in that water, he thought, would have let himself go under, or tried to swim away and hide. He said, plainly, that it astonished him. He had been told these men were soft. He had watched them fly into his guns. He had watched them charge his fleet in tin boats and throw pistols at his cruisers. And now he watched them, sunk and freezing and beaten by every measure that should count, lift their arms out of the sea and wave. The word he had carried since boyhood was gone for good. And then, with victory sitting right in front of him, the Japanese admiral turned his fleet around and left. He did not have to. His battleships were barely scratched. The path to the American landing ships, the whole reason he had come all this way and lost all those men, lay open just beyond the little carriers he had been chasing. He turned north instead, and sailed away. Men have argued about that decision for 80 years, and they are arguing still. Part of it is plain enough. The mistake his lookouts had made at dawn never lifted from his mind. Hour after hour, everywhere he turned, American planes came diving at him out of the smoke, and he had no clear way to count them. Nothing his own eyes told him was true. By the time he pulled back to gather his ships, 3 of his heavy cruisers were sunk or sinking, and the rest were trailing oil. Then came a radio message about an American fleet to the north, a message no one has ever fully explained, and he turned toward a battle that was not there. Why he made the choice he made, in the end, he mostly kept to himself. He lived out a hard and quiet life after the war and said little. The full truth went into the ground with him in 1978, but this much is not in dispute. The men on those little carriers, and the men flying off them with nothing left to fight with, had made the most powerful fleet in that ocean believe it was in more danger than it was. They could not sink his battleships, so they convinced him he was surrounded by giants, and the giant blinked. There was a final cruelty waiting for Taffy 3. after the battleships had gone. Out of the clouds came a new kind of attack. Japanese planes deliberately flown into the American carriers, pilots turning themselves into weapons. One of them came down through the flight deck of the carrier St. Lo, the same little ship whose patrol had spotted the Japanese fleet at first light, and touched off a fire in her belly that no one could stop. She was gone within the hour. Two more of those planes came down on another carrier, the Kalinin Bay, and by some mercy did not touch off the fires that would have finished her. The crews fought them off with whatever the ships had left, the same men who had been at it since first light, and when the last attacker was gone, they were still standing on decks, scarred and holed and streaked black with soot. The men who had just survived the impossible now had to survive that too. And the pilots who had spent the morning attacking battleships took off again and fought these planes as well. When it was finally over, the arithmetic had come out backward. The little force that should have been wiped from the sea had lost a few ships and held its ground. The great fleet that should have swept them aside had lost 3 heavy cruisers, seen a 4th crippled beyond use, and turned for home with its mission unfinished. The cost had been real, and it should be named. 2 of the little carriers were gone. Destroyers and destroyer escorts lay on the bottom, and they had taken hundreds of good men down with them. Some of the survivors drifted in the open sea for days before anyone reached them, and not all of them lasted until help came, but they had done the thing that could not be done. They had stood in the path of the most powerful fleet Japan had left, and they had turned it back. The landing ships they had come to destroy were never touched. The soldiers on the beach kept fighting inland. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had sailed out for one last great victory, went home instead, with its cruisers burning and its chance gone, never again to threaten an American fleet at sea. The door those pilots had thrown their empty hands against had held. Every man in Taffy 3 who lived, and many who did not, had earned something that morning that no medal could quite hold. They had been handed a hopeless job at dawn. And they had done it with depth charges, and pistols, and bluffs, and borrowed rifles, and a plain unwillingness to stand aside. They simply looked at what was bearing down on them, and at the ships they were meant to protect, and decided the answer was no. Come back to the beginning for a moment, to that single plane, flying between the tower and the stack of the largest battleship the world had ever built, through a wall of fire that could not touch it. We started there because a young enemy sailor never forgot it. He carried a piece of shrapnel under his skin for the rest of his life as a souvenir of those days. And he carried something else, too. The memory of watching men he had been taught to think of as cowards fly into his guns, charge his fleet, and wave at his battleship from the water with their ships burning behind them. The weapon that never ran out that morning was never in the bomb bay. It was in the men. These were somebody's sons. In a few short years, many of them would be somebody's fathers, and then somebody's grandfathers, the quiet men at the end of the table who did not much like to talk about the war. Men who once dived on battleships with empty guns because the alternative was to leave their friends to die, and who could not bring themselves to do it. You may have known one of them. A man who fixed cars, or preached on Sundays, or ran a hardware store on Main Street, and who once, when he was very young, flew a little plane at a battleship because his friends were dying and he could not think of a single thing to do but go back in. They did not tell those stories easily. A great many of them never told them at all. If your father or your grandfather wore the uniform in the Pacific, or a few years later in the cold hills of Korea, then you are the keeper of a story like this one. And those stories are slipping away from us a little more with every year that passes. Tell it while you still can. Leave it in the comments below so the rest of us can read it. A name, a ship, a place, whatever you have, because the men off Samar proved something on that gray morning in 1944 that is worth holding on to. That courage is not the weapon in your hands. It is the decision to attack when your hands are empty. In 1945, Japan still had ships, big ones, Steel monsters that on paper could still fight, but many of them did not sail. Not because the guns were gone, not because there were no sailors left, because there wasn't enough fuel. And once you understand that, the Pacific War looks different. Because the decisive battle wasn't always a carrier duel. It wasn't always a headline moment. It was a slow, grinding operation that attacked something less glamorous, but far more important. Shipping, fuel, ore, food, everything an empire needs to stay alive. A navy without fuel is just floating metal. A factory without raw materials is just a building. An empire without shipping is an empire that can't breathe. To see how this happened, we have to go back to 1942, when Japan looked unstoppable. Early 1942, the map is almost shocking. Japanese forces sweep across Southeast Asia, bases fall, ports change flags, and suddenly Japan has what it had long feared it would never secure in a prolonged war. Oil, rubber, bauxite, iron ore, coal, rice. On land, it looks like a solution, but on the ocean, it becomes a problem. Because those resources don't matter until they reach the home islands, and the only way they reach the home islands is by ship. Not one ship, thousands. Tankers, freighters, coasters, transports, ships moving north, ships moving south, ships moving every day. This is the part most people miss. Japan wasn't just fighting a war of battles. Japan was fighting a war of distance. Distance between the mines and the mills. Distance between the oil fields and the refineries. Distance between the factories and the front lines. Victory depended on keeping that distance bridged every week, every month, every year. And that bridge was made of merchant shipping. Picture a tanker leaving the Dutch East Indies. No armor, no heavy guns, just a long, vulnerable hull packed with fuel. If that tanker reaches Japan, planes fly, ships sail, factories run. If it doesn't, everything starts to slow down. One missed shipment doesn't end a war, but a pattern does. And there was another problem Japan couldn't escape: geography. A huge amount of Japanese shipping had to funnel through a narrow, predictable zone, a choke point between China and the Philippines, a corridor that cargo traffic could not simply abandon, because you can't reroute an empire the way you reroute a car. Not at scale, not under pressure. Cut that route, and you don't just sink ships. You strangle the flow that keeps the empire alive. Now here's the twist. In the years before the war, the U.S. Navy didn't expect submarines to be the backbone of a merchant shipping campaign. In 1930, the United States even joined Britain in calling for submarines to be banned under the First London Naval Treaty. That proposal never became international law, but the attitude behind it was real. American disdain for submarine attacks on civilian shipping was strong in the 1930s, and American submarines weren't designed primarily as merchant hunters. They were fleet submarines, big, long-range, loaded with torpedoes, built to stalk warships across the Pacific. So when the war came, the plan, at least in theory, was to use surface forces operating from forward bases to blockade Japan, not submarines. But war doesn't care about plans. On December 7, 1941, Japan struck Pearl Harbor, and just 4 hours later, Admiral Harold Stark, the chief of naval operations, issued a new order: unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. 4 hours. That's how fast doctrine changed. And in that order, you can almost hear the logic forming. If Japan is an island empire, then shipping is its lifeline. So attack the lifeline. In 1942, American submarines spread across the Western Pacific. But this is important. 1942 was not a year of clean victory. Not yet. Pacific submarines were given a wide variety of tasks: mining, reconnaissance, weather reporting, supply runs to hard-pressed garrisons, and a lot of patrol time still went into their original purpose, trying to intercept Japanese warships. Those attacks rarely worked. Warships were fast, hard to catch, hard to engage. In 1942, of 23 contacts with Japanese capital ships, only 4 resulted in damage. None were sunk. Japan's own submarines, in some ways, were more successful against American warships early on. So, if you're looking for a neat, heroic story where everything clicks immediately, that's not 1942. And then there was the weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, developed in the 1920s, untested in combat when the war began. Almost as soon as fighting started, crews began reporting failures, hits that didn't explode, shots that should have worked, that produced nothing but silence. There were 2 detonation systems, a contact detonator and a magnetic detonator meant to trigger beneath a ship. Later, it would become clear that both systems had serious problems, and the Navy was slow to acknowledge it, slower to fix it. By the end of 1942, no full live tests had taken place, and submarines would enter 1943 still carrying temperamental torpedoes. Imagine that. You locate a target, you close the distance, you take the risk, you fire, and you can't trust the explosion. That kind of uncertainty doesn't just affect results, it affects behavior. It changes how aggressively captains press attacks, how willing they are to close range, how often they gamble. Because in a submarine, gambling gets you killed. So what did 1942 actually accomplish? In the heat of war, claims inflated. It was easy to misjudge the size of ships, easy to assume a target sank when it merely limped away. A post-war report by the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee put the 1942 figure at 154 Japanese merchant ships sunk by submarines. Aircraft, mines, and other causes accounted for another 87 ships. Either way, the result in 1942 was not yet decisive. Japan's merchant marines still moved. Japan's factories still ran. Japan's armies still pushed outward, and in Tokyo, many leaders still believed the war would be decided the way they had always imagined, by a decisive fleet action, a single crushing naval battle. That belief shaped everything. It shaped how Japan built, how it trained, how it guarded its shipping. Because if you believe the war ends in one great battle, you don't prepare for a long, ugly campaign to protect merchants. But under the surface, literally, something crucial was being learned. Because when you look at the 1942 numbers closely, one pattern stands out. Historian Clay Blair argued that submarines should have focused overwhelmingly on Japanese merchant shipping, especially in the Key Zone northwest of the Philippines. And the numbers back up why he believed that. He recorded that 54 war patrols mounted into that region were responsible for 81 sinkings, more than 40% of the total for the year. Think about that. Not the entire Pacific. One zone, one choke point, one corridor where Japan's empire had to pass through narrow water to stay fed and fueled. That's not just a statistic. That's a map showing you where the war could be won. So here is where the story truly begins. Not with a dramatic explosion, with a realization. In 1942, the strangulation wasn't complete, but the hand was on the throat. Japan did not yet feel the full pressure. The flow still moved, but the flow had become predictable. And once something becomes predictable, it becomes targetable. A tanker doesn't dodge the way a destroyer does. A freighter doesn't outrun a submarine the way a cruiser can. Merchant shipping follows routes, schedules, habit, which means it can be hunted. By the end of 1942, Japan was still expanding on the map, but the foundation under that expansion was fragile. An island empire can seize resources, it can seize ports, it can seize territory, but it cannot create a new ocean. It cannot erase distance, and it cannot survive if the ships stop moving. 1942 was the opening act, the year the strategy changed, the year the patterns appeared, the year the lifeline was identified. The question was no longer whether Japan could be hurt through shipping. The question was how fast the pressure would rise once American submarines solved their problems and concentrated their effort where it mattered most. Because when the numbers began to climb, Japan wouldn't be fighting for islands anymore. Japan would be fighting for fuel. And without fuel, everything else becomes theater. If 1942 was the year the lifeline was identified, it was also the year the weapon failed. Because knowing where to strike is one thing, actually breaking the artery is another. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, American submarines moved into Japanese shipping lanes with urgency. The order had been given. Unrestricted submarine warfare was in effect. The target was clear, but almost immediately something was wrong. USS Sargo made contact in December 1941. A solid firing solution, good angle, good range, 8 torpedoes fired at 4 different targets. Nothing, no explosion, no plume of water, no debris, just silence. Days later, the skipper tried again. This time, he double-checked every calculation, closed the range dangerously tight, about 1,000 yards, fired 4 torpedoes. All 4 failed to explode. It was not an isolated case. Reports came in from across the Pacific. Perfect shots, solid hits, dull thuds instead of detonations. The standard American submarine weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, was betraying the men who depended on it. On paper, the Mark 14 was advanced. It had 2 detonation systems, a contact pistol meant to explode when it struck a hull, and a magnetic exploder designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel for maximum damage. In theory, it was devastating. In practice, it ran too deep. It detonated prematurely, or it failed to detonate at all. A submarine captain could risk everything: approach at night, evade escorts, slip inside a convoy screen, and then watch his torpedoes pass uselessly beneath the target. The Navy was slow to accept the scope of the problem. There were explanations: operator error, misjudged depth, faulty angles, but patrol after patrol told the same story. By the end of 1942, no comprehensive live-fire testing program had fully addressed the flaws. Submarines went back out to sea, still carrying weapons their crews did not entirely trust. And that changes behavior. A submarine is a patient hunter, but it is also fragile. One well-placed depth charge can end everything. When your torpedo might fail, you hesitate before taking risks. You fire from farther away. You withdraw earlier. Aggression drops. Results drop. Meanwhile, Japan's merchant fleet kept moving. Oil tankers left the Dutch East Indies. Freighters carried ore northward. Transports ferried troops and supplies across newly conquered territory. In 1942, American submarines sank 154 Japanese merchant ships, according to post-war assessment. Aircraft, mines, and other causes added another 87 losses. Significant numbers, but not crippling ones. In the Atlantic during the same period, German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping at a staggering rate. In the Pacific, the American campaign felt tentative by comparison, and that mattered, because Japan entered the war with no robust, fully developed doctrine for merchant protection in a prolonged conflict. The Imperial Navy had planned for a decisive fleet engagement, a climactic battle that would shatter an opponent's navy. It had not built its strategy around a grinding defensive convoy war. But in 1942, that oversight did not yet look fatal. The numbers weren't high enough. The pressure wasn't constant enough. The arteries were still open. There were deeper problems, too. American submarines were not concentrated. They were assigned varied missions: mine-laying, reconnaissance, supply transport, fleet scouting. Many patrols focused on warships rather than merchant vessels. Warships were glamorous targets. Sinking a cruiser meant headlines. But warships are fast. Merchants are predictable. In 1942, 23 contacts with Japanese capital ships resulted in only 4 cases of damage and no sinkings. Meanwhile, Japanese submarines managed to sink American carriers Yorktown and Wasp, and heavily damage North Carolina and Saratoga. If you paused the war at the end of 1942 and tallied submarine achievements alone, the picture would not look like overwhelming American dominance. And yet, buried in the data was something far more important than the total tonnage sunk. 54 war patrols mounted into the region northwest of the Philippines were responsible for 81 sinkings, more than 40% of the year's total. One region, one choke point, the corridor through which Japan's empire had to breathe. That statistic was not just an operational detail, it was a strategic revelation. If submarines were concentrated there, if torpedoes worked reliably, if patrol patterns were disciplined and relentless, then the war could be fought at the level Japan was least prepared to defend. Shipping. Because shipping is different from fleets. A fleet can retreat, it can regroup, it can avoid battle. Shipping cannot stop moving. Factories need inputs every week. Armies need ammunition every month. Pilots need fuel every day. A steady drip of losses is survivable. A surge is not. By late 1942, the drip had begun. Japan was not yet suffocating, but it was bleeding. Every tanker lost meant fuel that would not power engines. Every freighter lost meant ore that would not become steel. At first, these losses were absorbed. Imports continued. Production continued. But the war was stretching longer than Tokyo had anticipated. And long wars favor industrial systems that can sustain themselves. Japan's system depended on uninterrupted flow. And the United States, despite its misfires and flawed torpedoes, was beginning to learn how to attack that flow. There was another shift underway as well: leadership. In February 1943, Rear Admiral Robert English was killed in a plane crash. Command of Pacific submarines would pass to Charles Lockwood. Lockwood studied the numbers, he studied the patrol maps, and he saw what the raw totals obscured. Concentration worked. The Luzon choke point mattered. Merchant ships were the true strategic targets. 1942 had been a year of experimentation, a year of frustration, a year of faulty weapons and dispersed effort. But it had also been a year of data. Data that pointed toward a different kind of war. Not a glorious duel of battleships, not a cinematic carrier clash. A methodical destruction of logistics. And there was one more factor that would soon change everything: technology, radar improvements, better coordination between submarines, and, crucially, intelligence. Signals intelligence, ultra-decrypts, would increasingly provide insight into Japanese shipping movements. Routes would become less mysterious, convoys less invisible, the ocean would shrink, the prey would become easier to find. So at the end of 1942, the situation looked uncertain. Torpedoes were unreliable, strategy was evolving, results were uneven. But beneath that uncertainty lay momentum. The pattern had been spotted, the choke point identified, the weaknesses acknowledged, even if not yet fully corrected. Japan still believed in the decisive fleet battle, But the decisive battle had already begun. It just didn't look like one. It looked like statistics. It looked like shipping logs. It looked like missing tankers. And once the torpedoes began to explode the way they were supposed to, those statistics would accelerate. Because a modern empire can survive defeat in battle. What it cannot survive is the slow destruction of its supply lines. 1942 proved the arteries could be cut. 1943 would prove they could be severed. By early 1943, the Pacific submarine campaign was no longer improvising. It was focusing. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood took command of Pacific submarines in February, after the death of Robert English. Lockwood was not interested in glamorous targets. He was interested in effect. He studied patrol reports. He studied loss tables. He studied geography. And one fact stood out above all others. A disproportionate number of sinkings came from a single region, the waters northwest of the Philippines. A choke point. If Japan's empire depended on moving raw materials north, then that corridor was its jugular. So Lockwood changed the math. In 1942, only about 15% of patrols from Hawaii were directed into that key zone. In 1943, roughly 50% were. That shift alone reshaped the war under the surface. And there was something else changing: the torpedoes. Through persistent testing and hard-won field experience, the Navy began isolating the Mark 14's problems. The depth mechanism was recalibrated. The unreliable magnetic exploder was disabled. Contact pistols were redesigned. It took time, far too much time. But by September 1943, the major defects had finally been corrected. 22 months into the war, from that point forward, when an American submarine lined up a shot and heard a solid hit, it usually meant an explosion. That reliability changed everything. Aggression returned. Captains pressed closer. They took risks again. They attacked convoys with renewed confidence, and the numbers responded. In 1943, American submarines sank 335 Japanese ships, an enormous jump from the previous year. Another 135 were lost to other causes: aircraft, mines, surface action. On paper, it was progress. In Tokyo, it was a warning, because the effect was no longer limited to shipping statistics. It began showing up in import totals. In 1942, Japan had imported more than 20 million tons of essential materials. In 1943, that figure dropped to approximately 16.4 million tons. Coal, iron ore, bauxite, rice. A decline of several million tons in a single year. Not catastrophic yet, but not trivial. An industrial war does not collapse in a day. It weakens. Production quotas get revised, margins shrink, reserves thin. By late 1943, Japanese naval leadership finally acknowledged the threat. A dedicated merchant escort command was established under Admiral Koshiro Oikawa. It was an admission that shipping defense required more attention, but attention does not equal capacity. At the start of the war, Japan possessed 69 destroyers. By the end of 1943, 38 had been sunk. Destroyers were needed for fleet operations, for escorting capital ships, for combat missions across the Pacific. They were not enough to properly screen every convoy. Japan began constructing smaller escort vessels, similar in concept to British corvettes in the Atlantic. But most of those ships would not enter service in meaningful numbers until the latter half of the war. The convoy system was improving, but it was improving late. Meanwhile, American submarines were improving faster. Technology helped. Improved radar allowed submarines to detect targets at night with increasing reliability. Coordinated attacks what became known as wolf packs, were introduced, allowing multiple boats to converge on a convoy. And perhaps most importantly, intelligence improved. Ultra-decrypts provided insight into Japanese shipping movements. Routes that once required guesswork became increasingly predictable. The Pacific was vast, but shipping lanes are not. Shipping follows efficiency, and efficiency follows patterns. By 1944, the campaign entered a different phase. The United States seized the Mariana Islands, Saipan, and Guam, bringing American air and naval power dramatically closer to Japan's vital sea lanes. That geographical shift tightened the noose. Submarines were no longer operating from distant Pearl Harbor alone. They now had forward positions nearer to the arteries of Japanese commerce. And the results were staggering. In 1944, American submarines sank 548 Japanese merchant ships. Another 432 were destroyed by other Allied forces, largely aircraft from carriers and land bases that could now strike deep into the East China Sea. Nearly 1,000 merchant vessels lost in a single year. That is not attrition, that is devastation. Imports tell the story plainly. By 1944, Japanese imports fell to around 10 million tons, half of what they had been just 2 years earlier. The merchant fleet itself shrank dramatically, from approximately 4.1 million tons of shipping capacity to about 2 million, half the fleet gone. And unlike warships, merchant ships cannot be replaced quickly under wartime pressure, especially when the raw materials to build them must cross the same threatened waters. The consequences rippled outward. Steel production declined sharply. Aluminum output fell. Fuel reserves tightened. Training programs were affected. Pilot training requires fuel. Fleet exercises require fuel. Operational readiness requires fuel. When tankers disappear, training hours disappear. And when training hours disappear, experience declines. The imbalance revealed itself in 1944 during the air battles over the Philippine Sea, what American forces later called the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan's air crews were brave, but bravery cannot substitute for training, and training requires fuel. By late 1944, the situation worsened further. American forces began retaking the Philippines. With U.S. forces now based so close to the Luzon choke point, the critical shipping route northwest of the island was nearly severed. Oil transport to the home islands slowed to a crawl. What had begun in 1942 as sporadic losses had become systemic collapse. Factories could not operate at full capacity. The Navy could not maneuver freely. The Empire still possessed territory. It still possessed ships, but it no longer possessed secure movement between them. And that is fatal in a maritime war. The Imperial Japanese Navy had prepared for a climactic fleet engagement. Instead, it was being defeated by arithmetic. 335 ships in 1943, 548 in 1944, 10 million tons of imports, 2 million tons of remaining merchant shipping. Those are not battlefield headlines, but they are the kind of numbers that decide wars long before surrender documents are signed. By the end of 1944, the question was no longer whether Japanese shipping could be threatened, it was whether it could survive at all. Because when half your merchant marine is gone and the sea lanes themselves are under constant surveillance, every voyage becomes a gamble. And increasingly, the odds were no longer in Japan's favor. The strangulation was no longer theoretical, it was measurable. And once measured, it became unstoppable. By early 1945, the war in the Pacific was still violent. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, relentless bombing raids. On the surface, it looked as though the conflict was still being decided by fleets, aircraft, and armies. But beneath that visible war, something more decisive had already happened. Japan could no longer move enough fuel, and without fuel, modern war collapses. In 1944 alone, Japan had lost more than half of its remaining merchant shipping capacity. By the end of that year, imports had fallen to roughly 10 million tons, down from more than 20 million just 2 years earlier. By early 1945, the situation was even worse. Oil shipments reaching the home islands had slowed to a trickle, not zero, but nowhere near sufficient. A navy runs on fuel. A battleship might consume thousands of tons in a single operation. A carrier task force burns through oil at staggering rates. Without steady tanker traffic, those ships cannot deploy. And by 1945, much of the Imperial Japanese Navy was immobilized, not destroyed at sea, but trapped in port. Steel hulls, working guns, crews ready, but insufficient oil to maneuver at scale. An operational fleet requires movement, and movement requires fuel. The impact was not confined to ships. Aircraft demand even more discipline in logistics. Pilot training requires hundreds of flight hours before combat readiness. Each hour burns fuel. As shortages intensified, training programs were cut back. Flight hours were reduced. Replacement pilots entered combat with less experience than their predecessors. By the time of major air battles in 1944, the effects were visible, and by 1945, they were undeniable. Fuel scarcity had become a strategic limiter. In some cases, desperate attempts were made to supplement petroleum supplies. There were efforts to extract usable fuel from pine roots and other substitute materials. These were not scalable industrial solutions. They were symptoms of crisis. A modern industrial state was attempting to improvise fuel from forests. That is not a sign of resilience. It is a sign of exhaustion. Meanwhile, the submarine campaign itself shifted character. In 1945, American submarines sank roughly 160 Japanese ships, lower than the massive figures of 1944. Not because submarines had become less effective, but because there were fewer targets left to sink. Much of Japan's remaining merchant fleet was bottled up in port. Ships were reluctant to sail, and when they did, they faced not just submarines, but aircraft and increasingly widespread mining operations. Mines dropped outside harbor entrances added another layer of strangulation. Ports that once pulsed with activity grew quiet. A maritime empire had become static, and a static maritime empire is already defeated. Across the entire war, Japan lost more than 9 million tons of shipping. More than 6 million tons of that loss occurred after the beginning of 1944. That timing matters because it means the collapse was concentrated, accelerated. By the time American strategic bombing intensified over Japanese cities, the industrial system those bombs targeted was already under severe strain. Production of steel and aluminum had fallen sharply. Fuel reserves were critically low. Transport between regions of the empire had become unreliable. The war machine was still functioning, but it was running on diminishing reserves. Modern warfare depends on sustained throughput of oil, throughput of ore, throughput of finished goods. Once throughput collapses, military strength becomes theoretical. Japan still had soldiers willing to fight. It still had weapons capable of inflicting damage, but it no longer possessed the economic circulation required for prolonged resistance at full intensity. And that is the quiet brutality of maritime strangulation. It does not announce itself with a single catastrophic battle. It accumulates. One tanker lost, another convoy shattered, another route made unsafe. Until eventually, what remains is not enough. It is easy, looking back, to focus on the great set-piece battles of the Pacific. Midway, Leyte Gulf, Okinawa. Those moments deserve their place in history. But there was another campaign running parallel to them, less dramatic, less visible, but equally decisive. A campaign conducted under the surface of the ocean. A campaign measured not in territory gained, but in tonnage lost. A campaign that attacked not warships first, but the foundation beneath them. The Japanese Navy had prepared for a decisive fleet engagement. It did not prepare for a sustained war against its merchant marine. And when that war came, the adjustment came too late. By 1945, the question was no longer whether Japan could win a great naval battle. It was whether Japan could fuel one. When fleets cannot sail, strategy narrows. When pilots cannot train, air power erodes. When factories cannot receive raw materials, production declines. And when production declines in an industrial war, options disappear. So, when we look at 1945 and see ships anchored in harbor, aircraft grounded for lack of fuel, and an empire struggling to sustain itself, we are seeing the end result of a campaign that began quietly in 1942. A campaign that identified a choke point, solved a technical failure, concentrated force, and then tightened steadily. The decisive blows in war are not always the most visible. Sometimes they are delivered through ledgers and logistics, through shipping routes and fuel stocks, through arithmetic. In the Pacific, American submarines did sink warships, but more importantly, they sank the lifeline that allowed those warships to function. And once the fuel was gone, the outcome was only a matter of time.